Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review, and today we're taking a look at some cables that I received recently from Effect Audio. Effect Audio chose to do the release of these cables in quite an interesting way, and so I'm going to share with you my journey through the review process in the same way that I experienced it myself. And specifically what I mean by that is that Effect Audio started off by sending me these two cables with no branding at all. So I knew it came from Effect Audio because they'd organised it with me, but beyond that I didn't know what the pricing was, what the model name was, even what the materials were on the inside. They were just two different cables that I was provided to take a listen to and see what I thought. I wasn't the only one that had this experience. There were a number of other people through HeadFi and various other platforms that were sent these cables to try out and share their thoughts. It certainly made for a very interesting process because along the way it meant that we had no idea of what we were actually listening to. It helped to reduce any sense of bias, whether it be due to the price of the cables, what the materials were on the inside, although on this one you can kind of see what's going on in there. But it was a really interesting process to just listen to the cable with no sense of how it should perform, what it should or shouldn't sound like based on the materials. It was just a nice way to explore the merits of each cable on its own. And so what I'm going to do now is share with you a few different tracks and IEMs that I listened to as I tried to get a sense of how I liked and didn't like sometimes the sound of these cables. I've got another couple of cables that I'll mention along the way as a comparison point, keeping in mind I had no idea what the price of these was when I did these comparisons. And then at the end, I'll tell you a little bit more about the specific models, what they're made of, etc. And also the pricing, of course, as well. And then also refer to a couple of other IEMs that I think these pair really nicely with. And so let's get started with a quick explanation of what I received, what the finished version looks like, just some general design, and not specifications because I'll hold that till the end, but just some design and general product quality comments. And then I'll talk you through my listening notes and my impressions before coming back around to the details about these cables. The first thing to mention is that both cables are really nicely made. They both feature nice weaves, but they're actually different weaves from each other. So the copper cable here is just a very simple kind of four-way braid, while the grey coloured cable has a more complicated weave that ends up making it a square profile cable. Both of them are great. I particularly do like the look and feel of the grey cable in terms of its weave, but both are really nice to interact with. The connectors and the wire splitters and things like that arrived on the generic unbranded versions, those were nice, but it's not really representative of the final product. So let me put these down and talk about the final product. In the final product, what you get is a really nice quality plug at each end. Depending on which version you order, it's available with 3.5mm, 4.4mm, etc. And you're getting a really nice plug at the amp end, a really nice kind of carbon fibre splitter design in the middle here, and then finishing off with whatever your choice of termination is. But the good news is, regardless of whether it's 2-pin or MMCX or whatever else might be available on the website, you're getting a nice quality connector, at least based on the two examples I have, which are 2-pin and MMCX. The ear hooks used are just a very simple heat shrink version, so they're very flexible and soft, they never get in the way, they don't hold too much shape, and really everything about the finished product of these is as good as or better than the unbranded versions that arrived. In the case of the grey cable, it's got this kind of lovely, soft, matte finish to the cable. It just feels really premium to hold. And in the case of the copper cable, if I take it out of its carry case, and I'll talk about that in a moment, it's more similar to the one that came in unbranded, with maybe some very slight variations, but they're subtle enough that you don't really notice them. In both cases, they both look and feel really nice. I think the grey cable feels a bit more premium, but both are excellent. And at this stage, remember, I'm only talking about the ergonomics. I'm talking about the plugs, I'm talking about the feel of the insulation, the terminations of the earphones, the wire splitter, just things like that. So we're not talking about sound just yet. I will get there. Before I do, the other thing that came in the packet was this case. And I want to just share with you a little brain fade moment that I had. When I first got this little piece here was wrapped around the cables. That's also what it's for. It provides a loop that you can put around the cable to keep it all together. And then I had this little pouch. And I was looking at it. You've got a male stud on the front. You've got a female stud thing on the back. And I was looking at it thinking, how does this thing do up? And so to save you the embarrassment that I had, thankfully it was just to myself, but to save you that embarrassment, these don't do up. It's so you can actually use the cable loop here to go from the front stud there over to the back and keep your cable safely tucked inside the pouch. So don't be a Lachlan, do work it out quickly and don't look like a fool and enjoy your pouch that you get from Effect Audio. I think it's a nice pouch, by the way. It's a good size that if you want to use it for your actual IEMs with the cable you can, or of course you can just store the cable itself in there. But let's now get to the bit that you really want to know about, and that is how do these influence the sound, if at all? Now, I am a believer in cables influencing sound. I've had way too many different experiences across multiple cables to think that they're all the same. If you do think they all sound the same, then you can use the chapter markers below to jump through to the end, where I'm going to talk a bit more about the pricing and models of these. And you can just find out how much they cost and decide if you want that upgrade from a purely ergonomic point of view. But if you're someone like me that thinks that cables can make a slight alteration to the character of the sound, then watch on as I talk you through the journey that I had with the unbranded version of these cables. Now at this point, to make it a bit easier, I might share with you the names of these. You can already see it on the boxes next to me. And so what we've actually got here is an unbranded version of the Aries S cable and an unbranded version of the Eros S cable. So remember, as I was listening to these, I didn't know that that was what they were. I had no pricing information. But to keep things simple, I am going to refer to them as Aries and Eros. For my first round of listening test, I went for an IEM that's not overly expensive, but it's a nice IEM in the Kiwi Orchestra. I have reviewed that on the channel and I'll put a card here so you can take a look at that review if you want to. But I hooked up the Kiwi Orchestra using both of these cables as well as some others that I'll talk about in a moment, and one of the tracks I listened to was Midnight Rambler by the Rolling Stones. After kicking things off with the stock cable for the Kiwi Orchestra, I then moved over to the unbranded Aries cable. And what I immediately heard from that was a sound that was a little bit smoother, a little bit richer, but still with all of the detail, separation, etc. I find that the Kiwi Orchestra are a really nice IEM, but it just has a slightly overdone top end for me. It has just a little bit too much in that sort of upper mid-range treble area. I think from memory the Kiwi is more about the treble, and I found that the Aries cable helped to just pull that back a little bit. As with any earphone or headphone cable, we're not talking about a night and day change. But to me, it was a nice upgrade on the stock cable without drastically changing the overall tonality or presentation, smoothing off the treble a little bit, giving it just a touch more body and weight in the music, but other than that, leaving it fairly well intact and definitely, most importantly, not losing any detail along the way. And so my first experience of an Effect Audio cable was a positive one with the Aries. Next up, I switched over to the unbranded Eros cable, and what I heard was once again a slightly smoother sound than the stock cable on the Kiwi Orchestra. The sound from the Eros was a bit brighter than it was from the Aries, but it wasn't aggressive in any way, so it managed to smooth off, or maybe we could say refine, the treble that was coming from the stock cable on the Kiwi Orchestra, but it didn't make it quite as smooth or rich as what I was hearing from the Aries cable. What I did find happen with the Eros cable though, was that it separated the sounds in an interesting way. It kind of broke them apart differently, it sort of over-separated the sounds in some ways, not to the point that it became completely incoherent, but I felt like the sound from the copper cable, that being the Aries cable, was maybe just a touch more natural, whereas the Eros cable was giving it a slightly artificial sense of separation, which was interesting and exciting, but for absolute purists, it might be making it a touch artificial. To see just how well these currently unknown cables matched up with some more expensive cables, and keeping in mind I had no sense of what these were going to cost, I was able to put these up against a pure silver cable from Norn Cables, which was very graciously provided by Brocco Lee, who's a long-term channel patron, so thanks Brocco for sending that through. And this Norn cable that I was using was a pure Litz cable that retails for about $790 US. So we're talking a really, really top-end cable here. The Norn Silver Litz cable was clearly brighter again than either of the Effect Audio cables, and it also provided exceptional separation of the sound. In my notes, and we're still talking about the Kiwi Orchestra and the same track on this occasion, which was Midnight Rambler, just to remind you, the Norn cable was giving me this wonderfully pure sound. The separation was really strong, but also natural. The sound was bright, but not overly harsh. and overall I would describe the sound as becoming a little bit more treble focused with the silver cable, but that was mostly because there was a bit less sense of weight and body in the sound rather than it being extra treble, if that makes sense. And so the Norn cable was enjoyable to listen to, but it definitely changed the character of the earphones compared to both the stock cable but also either of these Effect Audio ones. My final comparison was another quite different cable again, in the Eros Audio Ikigai. I reviewed this cable quite some time ago. It's another uber expensive IEM cable, but a really beautiful one. The Ikigai uses a normal stranded cable, but with extremely high purity, high quality copper. And to me, the sound from the Ikigai was the more tonally accurate or balanced sound out of all the ones that I tried. Now, of course, I don't know what the original recording was meant to sound like. And so when I say that it was the most tonally balanced, what I mean is that it seemed to bring everything in the mix into a better sense of balance within that mix. So there was less sense of anything being enhanced or pulled back. Everything was just really well aligned throughout the entire frequency range. I felt like the Ikigai cable sort of flattened the soundstage a bit compared to the silver cable from Norn, and it made things a bit more left and right rather than having a bit of extra depth, which the Norn cable seemed to provide. I don't know if that's better or worse because, again, I don't know how it's meant to sound, but there was definitely a difference in the sense of depth between the two cables. Finally, the Ikigai cable provided some of the most fantastic treble quality that I've heard out of these IEMs with any of these cables, because there was lots of detail and clarity, but again an excellent sense of refinement. And so at the end of this round of listening with the Kiwi Orchestra, my feelings were that both of the Effect Audio cables were really nice. They were both an upgrade over the stock cable for the Kiwi Orchestra, but they also weren't playing at the level of $800 to $1,000 cables. Now remember, at this stage I had no idea if they should have been, so I just kept rolling on and trying some other tests. Before I talk about the next test though, I just want to quickly finish summarising what I heard with the Kiwi Orchestra, and that is that at this stage I was beginning to feel like the copper coloured cable from Effect Audio was probably a pure copper cable of some description. Maybe copper lits, maybe stranded copper, but it was most similar to the Eros Ikigai in terms of its tonal balance, and therefore at this stage I was figuring it was pure copper and it was sounding really nice. In the case of the unbranded grey cable, which was the Eros, at this stage I was thinking that it probably wasn't pure copper or silver because it was different to both the pure copper Ikigai and the pure silver Norn cable. So I was figuring it was maybe some kind of hybrid, but I had no sense of what sort of hybrid. Maybe it was silver plated copper, maybe it was a mixed copper and silver cable, I didn't know. But for me, its tonality was sitting somewhere between the Ikigai as a pure copper and the Norn cable as a pure silver, and its interesting way of separating the sounds had me still guessing. And so now let's talk about the next test, and that was using the custom art FIBAE 3x3. And I specifically chose these because they are a very revealing earphone, particularly through the mid-range. They're quite a simple 3-balanced armature design, but they're very insightful, and I hope they'd give me an even better sense of what was going on with these cables. One of the tracks I listened to for this test was No Other Way by Jack Johnson, and this time I decided to mix things up and start with the Eros Audio Ikigai. Once again, the sound was very smooth and clean, but I was finding the 3x3 on this track to be just a little bit too bright in the upper end. There was a sense of extra crispness, and it could be the recording, but either way it was a bit too much for me, and I wasn't enjoying it quite so much. Having said that, the vocals came through wonderfully focused with the combination of the Ikigai and the 3x3. And so with that bass line in place, I then swapped back over to the copper coloured Effect Audio cable, and I immediately felt like it better suited the tuning of the 3x3s. Not that it was a better cable necessarily, but it just synergised better with its slightly smoother sound compared to the Ikigai. Specifically what I found with the Eros cable was that it pulled back the treble a little bit compared to the Ikigai, and its extra sense of weight and body through the mid-range helped to bring those vocals forwards a bit and just balance everything out better. To me, with the 3x3, the copper cable from Effect Audio was a really lovely match. It's a pairing that I would very happily keep together permanently because they just go together so well. It showed me that the sound from the copper cable from Effect Audio was clearly richer, a little bit thicker than the Ikigai, and that can be better or worse, as I'll talk about at the end. The Ikigai is an amazing cable. It's a better cable in my opinion than the copper cable from Effect Audio, but that doesn't mean it's going to suit everybody's preferences or every IEM better. And so I switched over now to the Norn silver cable again, and similar to the Ikigai, it was really bordering on being a bit too crisp in that top end. I also felt like it was once again lacking some body, and that's partly because the 3x3s aren't a very bassy IEM. They've got quite a steep roll-off down low, and so that's where I think they benefited from the slightly richer, warmer sound that was imparted by the copper cable. I felt like the Norn silver cable brought a wonderful sense of clarity and texture and detail out of the 3x3s, but tonally it was just significantly less enjoyable than what I heard from the copper cable from Effect Audio. And so I then switched over to the grey Effect Audio cable, what we now know to be the Eros, and what I found was it was kind of combining the extension and energy that I heard, that being treble extension and treble energy that I heard from the non-silver cable. It combined that with more of the sense of weight that I heard from the copper cable. For me, on the 3x3, the grey cable from Effect Audio started to really balance out the best characteristics of the silver and the copper cables. I still felt like it was maybe slightly drawing out some sounds a little bit artificially perhaps, kind of over separating things, and therefore it wasn't always the most natural and totally coherent listen, but it was never ever bad. So tonally I think it was a nice balance with the 3x3, and in terms of the imaging and separation characteristics, I think it made it interesting. It allowed me to really listen into the mix a lot more, but not necessarily be the most natural if I just wanted to sit back and have it sound like I was in the room with the musicians. And so at this point, with no idea of the price or exactly what was going on inside each of these cables, I was really impressed with what I was hearing. My sense was that they weren't priced at the same level as something like the Norn or the Ikigai, but they were certainly performing like high quality cables with good quality materials. And so what I can tell you now, having received the proper branded version of these, is that the copper cable is a true copper Litz cable. As I've already said, it's called the Aries S, and it retails for $179. So it's hardly a cheap cable, but it's also nowhere near the level of something like the Ikigai. And I definitely think that you're getting good quality and good performance at the price. And in my opinion, it's an excellent upgrade to a lot of the stock cables out there. And in a moment, I will talk about the IEMs that I think best suit the copper cable here. But before I do, let me introduce the grey cable. The grey cable here, as we already know, is called the Eros S. And this is a combination of a pure copper Litz and a pure hybrid Litz. So in other words, there's pure copper wires in here and pure silver wires, with each individual strand being wrapped in its own insulation, which is what the Litz is all about. And that's why it was giving both the combination of the copper tonality, but also a little bit of that sense of that silver extension and brightness. But then I also think it's why it's giving a slightly different sense of presentation and separation of the sound, because the audio signal will travel slightly differently through the copper and through the silver. At least that's my understanding of the physics. And so I'm guessing that very subtle shifts in the timing of the signal coming through, and maybe the timing of specific frequencies coming through, is just ever so slightly shifting the presentation of the music. As I said earlier, that can make for some really fun and interesting exploration of all the different sounds in a mix, but it can also lead to a slightly less coherent overall sound. I'm not suggesting it pulls it apart completely like something like the Mesh Mark II did for me, which I didn't really enjoy because it started to actually become a distraction from the music. I didn't find that the Eros S made the music distracting in any way, but when I was doing critical listening between the Eros and the Aries did sound more natural to me. Now I should mention that in just a second I'm going to tell you that sometimes this actually suits certain IEMs really, really well, but before I do, the final detail I should tell you about the Eros S is that it retails for $299. So we've got $179 for pure copper, or for the hybrid of copper and silver, and in my opinion a nicer looking and feeling cable. For that you're spending $299. And to be clear, the Aries S is also a lovely looking and feeling cable. I just think the Eros S is really special in terms of its look and feel. And so I'm going to let you decide if you think there's a good value or not. That's entirely up to your preferences. It depends on the budget that you've put aside for your IEMs and which IEMs maybe you already own. That's going to vary from person to person. But what I can tell you is where I've found these two different cables to really excel. And that is that the Aries S, with its extra sense of weight and body that it can bring, and I really should clarify that when I'm saying extra weight coming from this cable, I mean that in reference to a lot of the IEMs on the market that are coming with cables that are silver-plated copper, maybe they're pure silver, or some other hybrid. A good example of this, and indeed an IEM where I really like the Aries S, is something like the T-Audio Monarch Mark II. That's a lovely earphone, but for me it just needs a bit more body and weight through the mids. The stock cable there is a high quality silver-plated copper cable, and to me it's a definite sonic upgrade adding on the Aries S. Likewise, I spoke before about the Kiwi Orchestra and also the FIBAE 3x3 from Custom Art, and in both cases the copper cable was an improvement over the stock cable to my ears. So for me, if you've got an IEM where you just wish it had a bit more kind of oomph behind it, and again, it's not going to be a huge transformation with cables, but it can just bring that little sense of extra body. It can help to smooth off overly aggressive treble by a couple of %. That's where I think the Aries S is great. On the other hand, if you have an earphone where you wish it had just a bit more separation, maybe it's a little bit of a thicker sound and you want a tiny bit more attack from it, that's where the Eros S can be a great choice. And as you might have seen attached to the cable here or in the Glamour video, for me the FIBAE FH9 is a great example of an IEM that fits this. I really like the FIOs with the bass tips installed, and the combination of the bass tips on the FIOs with the Eros S cable makes for a wonderful combination. Likewise, another IEM like the AudioFly AF1120 Mark II, that's got a wonderful sound to start with, but can for some people be just a bit too smooth. That's where again, I think the Eros S can help to bring it to life a bit. And so as always, there's no clear-cut best and worst here. It's about understanding what your earphones that you currently have might benefit from. Maybe they don't need an upgrade cable at all. There's no sense here from me that you have to upgrade your IEM cables. But if you've got a set of IEMs that's not quite hitting the mark for you and you otherwise really like them, then an upgrade cable like these can help to take that final 1 or 2% type step. And so if that's something that you're interested in, I'll put links through to the Effect Audio website down below. There's no affiliations or kickbacks here. They just sent me theirs to review and I happen to really like them. So if you're interested in one of these for yourself, check out the links below. And remember, the copper cable is going to be good for something that needs a bit more weight and body, maybe smoothing off a little bit of treble, whilst the hybrid Eros S cable is going to be better if you need a bit more separation, maybe a tiny bit more attack in the top end, but not extra aggression. And that's one of the things I really like about the Eros S, is it does actually balance the body and weight benefits of copper with the extension and detail benefits of silver. And so hopefully I've helped you to identify which of these might suit your particular IEMs. I should mention there is another model in between these two, which is a silver plated copper, I believe. I haven't heard that one, so I can't comment, but do check out other reviews if you're interested in that one. I know that there's plenty of reviews and impressions around, particularly on FIBAE, so check those out if you want to know more about the middle model. But for me, I think both of these are great. I'll very happily recommend them. And then it just comes down to you working out what your IEM is going to benefit most from. And so as always, I hope you found the review useful and helpful. If it has, I'd love it if you'd hit the like button, consider subscribing and ringing the notification bell if you haven't already. But for now, let me leave it to the music. So happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.